I investigate fraud for a living. I am paid to spot anomalies. At 37, my life ran on a flawless schedule, complete with a calm husband and a 7-year-old son sitting out in the waiting room. It only took 4 words to shatter my reality during a rainy morning checkup. The obstetrician who delivered my baby 7 years ago smiled over her medical chart. "How is your daughter?" she asked. I gave birth to a boy. My name is Natalie Sanders. I am 37 years old. I am a co-founder and the lead medical financial fraud investigator at Alder Klein Risk Advisory in Bellevue. My profession is built on a very specific premise. People lie. But numbers do not. I spend my days dissecting hospital billing codes, offshore accounts, and phantom insurance claims. I find the misplaced decimal points. I find the ghost patients. I see the tiny microscopic errors that everyone else ignores. I am paid, quite handsomely, to look at a perfectly constructed facade and locate the single loose brick. My personal life operated on the exact same principle of absolute airtight order. I have a stunning mid-century modern home in Kirkland. It features floor-to-ceiling windows and heated polished concrete floors. I have a husband named Owen Mercer. Owen is a wealth management consultant. He is calm, measured, and impeccably dressed. He speaks in low, soothing tones and never loses his temper. We have a son named Theo. He is 7 years old. He plays piano and takes tennis lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My life is scheduled down to the quarter hour. My calendar is a fortress. Everything has a place. Everything makes sense. Then came a Tuesday morning in November. It was raining. It was that heavy, relentless Pacific Northwest rain that turns the sky into a bruised gray wall and blurs the windshields of cars on the highway. Theo's private school sent an automated text message at 6:15 in the morning, a localized power outage. The campus was closed for the day. My flawless schedule instantly ruptured. I had a routine annual gynecological exam booked for 9 o'clock. Rescheduling a specialist in this city takes 4 months. I could not leave Theo home alone. I brought him with me. The drive was unremarkable. The traffic on the 405 was heavy, as always. Theo sat in the back seat, quietly playing a puzzle game on his tablet. He is a good boy. He is quiet. He does what he is told. The clinic was located on the 4th floor of a sleek medical building in downtown Bellevue. It was sterile, quiet, and smelled faintly of eucalyptus and industrial floor cleaner. I checked in at the front desk. I handed Theo my phone as a backup device and pointed to a blue vinyl chair in the waiting area. I told him I would be out in 30 minutes. He barely nodded. His eyes locked on the screen. A medical assistant called my name. I walked down the long, bright hallway. She directed me to step onto the digital scale. 130 pounds. She wrapped the cuff around my arm. Blood pressure was 115/72. Completely normal. I am always normal. She led me into examination room 3. She handed me a folded paper gown and told me the doctor would be right in. I took off my tailored slacks and my silk blouse. I folded them neatly and placed them on the plastic chair. I put on the paper gown. It was stiff. It crinkled loudly every time I took a breath. I sat on the edge of the examination table, the crinkly paper beneath me feeling cold against my bare legs. I stared at the medical posters on the wall. I waited. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door clicked open. It was not my regular physician. My regular physician was away on maternity leave. The clinic had sent an email about a covering physician, but I had merely skimmed it. A routine exam is just a checklist. I did not care who checked the boxes. The woman who walked into the room was perhaps in her late 50s. She had sharp, intelligent eyes, and her silver-gray hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot. She wore a white coat over dark scrubs. She held a digital tablet in her right hand. She looked down at the glowing screen. She tapped a file. Then she looked up at me. She froze. She did not just glance at me. She really looked. Her eyes locked onto my face, scanning my features with sudden, intense recognition. "Natalie Sanders," she said. It was not a greeting. It was a statement of fact. I looked at her face. I read her silver name tag. Doctor. Miriam Kessler. The name instantly slid into a dark, locked file cabinet in my brain. 7 years ago, a chaotic, terrifying night, a sudden, dangerous spike in my blood pressure. Monitors screaming, the fetal heart rate plummeting into the danger zone, the blinding glare of the surgical lights in the emergency operating room. Doctor. Miriam Kessler was the attending obstetrician on call that night. She was the woman who had sliced my abdomen open and pulled my child from my body to save us both. I felt a flicker of genuine gratitude. Dr. Kessler, I said, my voice softening. It has been a very long time. You look exactly the same, she smiled. The tension in her shoulders dropped. It was a warm, professional smile. It certainly has been, she said, stepping closer to the examination table. I am just covering the rotation here for a few weeks. It really is a small world. I never forget a face from a night like that. We engaged in the standard, meaningless dance of small talk. We talked about the relentless rain. We complained about the construction traffic on the highway. She put on a pair of latex gloves. She snapped them against her wrists. She checked my chart on the tablet once more, scrolling with her thumb. She sat down on the small rolling stool. She rolled closer to me. She looked up from the screen, her expression completely relaxed. So, she said, her voice bright and conversational. How is your daughter? The room went completely silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the thick glass window. I stared at her. I assumed I had misheard her. The acoustics in these clinical rooms could be strange. I shifted my weight on the table, and the paper beneath me tore slightly. You mean my son, I said. My tone was flat, reflexive, and polite. Theo, he is actually sitting out in the waiting room right now. He just turned 7. Doctor. Kessler stopped moving. The warm conversational smile did not slowly fade from her face. It was simply erased. Her posture stiffened. She looked down at the digital tablet in her lap. She scrolled back up, her brow furrowed into a deep V. She read the screen. Then she looked back up at me. The friendly doctor was gone. The woman looking at me now was a veteran surgeon evaluating a severe trauma. It says male infant right here in your consolidated file, she said softly, almost to herself. Yes, I replied, my voice steady. Because I gave birth to a boy. Doctor. Kessler slowly reached over and set the digital tablet face down on the stainless steel counter. The plastic casing made a sharp, definitive click against the metal. She did not argue with me. She did not raise her voice. She did not display a single ounce of emotional confusion. She looked directly into my eyes with the absolute, unshakable certainty of someone who has spent 30 years standing between life and death. A woman who knows the smell of amniotic fluid, the weight of a newborn, and the exact color of fresh blood under halogen lights. Natalie, she said. Her voice was cold, precise, and heavy as a stone. I was there. I was the one who cut you open. I held the baby under the surgical lights. I checked the initial vitals before they rushed you to the intensive care unit. I remember that specific night perfectly because your hemorrhaging was massive. She paused. She did not blink. I pulled a baby girl out of you. I did not gasp. I did not scream. My hands did not shake. My heart rate did not suddenly spike. I am a professional who lives and dies by verified data. I process facts, but in that exact fraction of a second, reality split violently in two. I looked at her hands resting on her knees. They were completely steady. I looked into her eyes. There was zero hesitation, zero doubt. She was not a confused, aging doctor misremembering a chaotic shift. She was a hostile witness introducing a piece of evidence that destroyed the entire narrative of my existence. I do not remember the physical mechanics of the rest of the examination. I must have answered her medical questions. I must have allowed her to proceed. My brain simply detached from my body. When it was over, I dressed myself. My movements were mechanical. I buttoned my silk blouse. I zipped up my tailored slacks. I tied the belt of my trench coat with perfectly symmetrical loops. I walked out of the room and down the hallway to the reception desk. I handed the receptionist my corporate credit card. I paid my $50 copay. I signed the electronic pad. I turned and walked into the waiting room. Theo was still sitting in the blue vinyl chair. He was wearing his yellow raincoat. His dark hair fell perfectly across his forehead. He was swiping his finger across my phone screen. He looked exactly like Owen, the exact same sharp jawline, the exact same shape of the eyes. "Ready to go, Mom?" he asked, not looking up from the game. "Yes," I said. I walked over and took his hand. His fingers were small and warm against my palm. We walked out of the clinic doors and into the concrete parking garage. The air was damp and cold with exhaust fumes. My face remained a mask of flawless, unreadable calm. My pulse beat a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. But as I unlocked my car, I felt it, a deep, silent, catastrophic structural failure inside my mind. It was the sensation of a massive steel foundation cracking under unimaginable pressure. No one else could see the damage. No one else could hear the tearing metal. But I knew. The perfect house I lived in was already falling down. I drove home in complete silence. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass, pushing away the heavy rain. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. I did not cry. I did not speed. When you discover a massive discrepancy in a financial ledger, you do not immediately kick down the door of the chief financial officer and demand a confession. You secure the ledger. You isolate the variables. You verify the raw data until the margin of error is reduced to absolute zero. I parked the car in our attached garage. I settled my son in the living room with a snack and a documentary about marine biology. Then, I walked upstairs to my home office. I locked the solid oak door behind me. I sat down at my desk and woke up my dual monitors. The screens cast a cold blue glow across the dark room. My first hypothesis was the most logically sound. The covering physician made a catastrophic clerical error, conflating my surgical history with another patient on that chaotic night 7 years ago. Memory is fallible. Data is not. I bypassed the hospital's patient-facing digital portal. The front-end interface only shows you what the system administrators want you to see. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and retrieved a heavy silver external hard drive. It held exactly 2 terabytes of encrypted personal backups. Every email, every scanned receipt, every medical chart from the past decade was meticulously categorized in nested folders. I navigated to the folder labeled with the year of my pregnancy. I opened the subfolder for medical records. My mouse clicked rhythmically in the quiet room. I ignored the narrative summaries and went straight for the raw imaging reports. I opened the PDF file of the anatomy scan conducted at week 20 of the pregnancy. It was a dense, 3-page document filled with biometric measurements: femur length, head circumference, heart rate. I scrolled to the bottom of the second page. There, buried under a section detailing the umbilical cord structure, was a single line of text accompanied by a grainy, low-resolution screenshot: fetal sex, female fetus. I stared at those 2 words. They were clinically detached, printed in standard 12-point Arial font. I minimized the window and logged into the current hospital portal using my 2-factor authentication. I pulled up the official discharge summary from the week of the birth. I read the final diagnosis section. The text was clear: live birth, male infant. A lesser investigator would stop there, assuming a simple typo had occurred at the 20-week mark, but I do not look at what the text says. I look at how the text was built. I downloaded the current hospital discharge summary and dropped the file into a forensic metadata extraction tool I use for corporate audits. The program stripped away the visual formatting and revealed the digital skeleton of the document. I read the chronological log of revisions. The original file was created on the night of the emergency surgery. The attending physician was listed as the author, but 72 hours later, long after I had been transferred out of the intensive care unit and the file should have been permanently sealed, a new entry appeared. The document had been unlocked. The data fields regarding infant gender, weight, and blood type had been manually overwritten. The user ID attached to the revision did not belong to a doctor. It did not belong to a nurse. It possessed a prefix designating an internal administrative account with high-level clearance. Someone had walked into the digital architecture of my medical history and quietly rearranged the furniture while I was lying in a hospital bed, heavily medicated on painkillers. This was not an accident. You do not accidentally bypass secure access protocols and manually alter post-operative records 3 days after an event. That requires intent. That requires a key. A cold, heavy stone settled at the bottom of my stomach. At 6 o'clock that evening, I walked downstairs to the kitchen. The smell of roasting garlic and rosemary filled the air. My husband stood by the marble island, expertly carving a roasted chicken. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked the way he always looked, perfectly composed, effortlessly in control, the picture of domestic stability. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I leaned against the counter, keeping my body language entirely relaxed. The power outage at the school was a mess, I said, my voice conversational. I had to drag the boy to the clinic with me. I am sorry I could not take him, my husband replied, keeping his eyes on the cutting board. His knife moved with precise, even strokes. Back-to-back conference calls all morning. How was the appointment? Fine. Routine. I took a slow sip of water. Though I actually ran into the surgeon who handled my emergency delivery, she was covering a shift. I watched his hands. I watched the angle of the blade. Really? He said. The response was too fast. The latency period between my statement and his reply was virtually non-existent. A normal person would pause. A normal person would search their memory for the doctor's name or ask a clarifying question about that traumatic night. His voice carried no surprise, no curiosity. It was entirely frictionless. Yes, I continued, keeping my tone light. She is getting older. She actually seemed a bit confused. She asked me how my daughter was doing. The knife did not slip. His breathing did not change. He smoothly transferred a piece of chicken to a ceramic plate. Well, he chuckled, a warm, resonant sound. You know how these massive hospital systems are. They see 50 patients a day. The older ones probably mix up the charts all the time. You cannot expect them to remember every detail from 7 years ago. He wiped his hands on a linen towel and turned to look at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with affectionate amusement. It was a flawless performance. It was the reaction of a man who had anticipated this exact conversation and had rehearsed his lines until they sounded like spontaneous thought. Anyway, he said, instantly pivoting away from the subject, we need to finalize the caterer for the 8th birthday party. I was thinking we should upgrade to the larger tent for the backyard. We are going to have a lot of family flying in this year. He smiled. He picked up the plates. He walked into the dining room. I remained standing in the kitchen. The silence hummed in my ears. The 8th birthday. It was still 6 weeks away, yet he had been obsessively focused on the logistics of this specific event for the past month. He had never cared about party planning before. Later that night, I went to tuck my son into bed. The room was softly lit by a small lamp on his nightstand. He was sitting up against the pillows, turning a heavy die-cast metal airplane over in his hands. It was an expensive, limited edition model. Where did you get that? I asked, sitting on the edge of his mattress. Aunt Lainey sent it, he said, not looking up from the toy. He spun the tiny propellers with his thumb. It came in the mail today. Dad gave it to me after school. Aunt Lainey, a nickname, a person who was not actually a blood relative, but an old associate of my husband's, whom I had only met in passing years ago. She lived in a different city. She had never sent a gift before. That was very nice of her, I said softly. I reached out and smoothed his blanket. Did she send a card? Dad read it to me, he replied, his voice drifting toward sleep. She said, "Happy early birthday," and she said this year, everything will finally be official. He yawned, dropping the airplane onto the blanket. He closed his eyes. oblivious to the weight of the words he had just spoken. Everything will finally be official. I stood up, I turned off the small lamp, I walked out of the bedroom and pulled the door shut until the latch clicked softly into place. I stood in the dark hallway of my beautiful, silent house. I did not feel rage. Rage is loud and chaotic. What I felt was absolute, crystalline clarity. The impossible question asked by the surgeon was not a random anomaly. The overwritten metadata, the frictionless lie in the kitchen, the strange message delivered to a child in the dark. They were all data points on a single, terrifying graph. I was not dealing with a medical error. I was standing in the center of a perfectly engineered architecture of fraud, built by the man sleeping in the master bedroom at the end of the hall. And I was going to tear it down, brick by brick, until there was nowhere left for him to hide. I did not hire a private investigator. Private investigators follow cheating spouses to cheap motels and take blurry photographs. I needed architects who understood how to dismantle a secure corporate fortress. 48 hours after the clinic visit, I paid a retainer of $15,000 from a compartmentalized offshore account I had maintained since long before my marriage. I hired 2 specialists to work entirely off the books. The first was a medical privacy attorney based in Portland, safely outside of the local Washington legal circuit. The second was a digital forensics contractor who usually handled defense logistics for the aerospace industry. We communicated through a heavily encrypted messaging application. I gave them a very narrow, highly specific scope of work. Find the hospital security access logs from the night of my surgery. Find the administrative audit trail of my patient file. I knew that if I wanted to win this war, I had to fight with certified evidence, not emotional accusations. The forensics contractor delivered the first package of raw data on a Thursday evening. I sat in my home office with the door locked, parsing through thousands of lines of security badge swipes. I filtered the data by timestamp, narrowing the parameters down to the 6-hour window surrounding my emergency delivery. A single glaring anomaly stood out at 2:14 in the morning. Someone had used a master keycard to badge into the restricted postpartum recovery wing. It was not a nurse on the night shift. It was not a security guard. The badge belonged to Elaine Mercer. Elaine is my husband's mother. At the time of my delivery, she was the director of obstetrics operations for that exact hospital network. She had officially retired 3 years ago. According to the family narrative, Elaine had been out of town at a medical conference the night I went into labor, arriving frantically the next afternoon with a bouquet of white lilies. Yet here she was, her unique radio frequency identifier logging her presence in the secure ward just 3 hours after I was wheeled into the surgical theater. She had no clinical reason to be there. She was an administrator. I directed the attorney to pull the anonymized admission records for the entire maternity ward for that specific 24-hour cycle. We were looking for a male infant, born within hours of my surgery. There were 4 male births that night. 3 of them were standard deliveries with matching pediatric follow-ups within the hospital network. The 4th was a ghost in the machine. A patient had been admitted through the emergency room under an altered insurance alias, but the billing address cross-referenced to a very real name, Delaney Price, age 29 at the time. She had given birth to a healthy male infant at 8:30 in the evening, roughly 4 hours before my own emergency surgery. The name Delaney Price triggered a faint, dormant memory. I closed my eyes and searched the archives of my professional life. 9 years ago, my husband had been consulting for a boutique venture capital fund in Seattle. Delaney Price was the external public relations consultant assigned to his team. I remembered meeting her once at a holiday cocktail party. She had striking dark hair, a sharp jawline, and an ambitious, calculating energy. Laney. Aunt Laney, the limited edition metal airplane my son had received in the mail just days ago. The pieces were locking together with a sickening, metallic click. The next morning, the second data package arrived. It contained the internal audit trail for the medical record modifications. When my digital file was unlocked and altered 3 days post-operation to change the gender of my baby, the system required a secondary management approval to finalize the overwrite. The digital signature on the approval workflow belonged to Elaine Mercer. She was the gatekeeper. She had authorized the erasure of my daughter. She had validated the existence of a son. People do not commit federal medical fraud, risk their professional licenses, and orchestrate a multi-generational kidnapping solely for the sake of covering up an extramarital affair. A man like my husband does not take uncalculated risks. There had to be an asset. There had to be a massive return on investment. I pulled my personal safe from the wall behind a framed architectural print. I unlocked it and took out a thick, leather-bound binder. It contained the operating agreement for the Sanders Family Trust. My grandfather had built a massive logistics empire, and the trust was the ironclad mechanism designed to protect the voting shares of the holding company. I turned to Section 4, Subsection 2. I read the legal phrasing, translating the archaic language into plain mechanics. The trust dictated that upon my death, my controlling shares would revert to the board. However, there was an activation clause. My firstborn, legally recognized child would automatically be granted an irrevocable beneficiary branch, absorbing a massive block of proxy voting rights. The exact moment they reached their 8th birthday, I stared at the page. The words seemed to vibrate against the heavy parchment paper. Their 8th birthday. My son was turning 8 years old in exactly 42 days. For the past 3 weeks, my husband had been casually, persistently dropping a glossy legal folder on my kitchen counter. He called it routine estate maintenance. He said our lawyers just needed to update the beneficiary schedules to ensure the boy was fully integrated into the family office before his birthday. I had been too busy with a corporate audit to read it. I had almost signed the signature page while drinking my morning coffee just a few days ago. If I signed those papers, and if the boy turned 8, an unshakable legal entity would be created. The child would possess voting power over the Sanders legacy, and because he was a minor, his legal father would act as the proxy manager of that immense wealth and power until the boy turned 21. I sat perfectly still. The oxygen in my office felt thin and cold. This was never just a betrayal of the heart. This was a hostile corporate takeover, executed through my own uterus. My husband had not simply fathered a child with another woman. He had partnered with his mother, leveraging her administrative power at the hospital. They had waited for the exact, chaotic moment of my emergency surgery. While I was bleeding out under anesthesia, they had taken Delaney Price's biological son and placed him in the bassinet beside my bed. They had taken my flesh and blood, my daughter, and made her vanish. They did not do this to save a marriage. They did this to plant a parasite inside the host of my family's wealth. A boy with his blood in Delaney's face, raised in my house, eating at my table, waiting for the clock to strike 8. I closed the leather binder. I placed it back into the steel safe. I locked the mechanism and spun the dial. I did not throw anything. I did not scream. My hands were perfectly steady. The initial shock had entirely burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute vacuum. They believed they had won. They believed they had successfully navigated the statute of limitations on their crimes. They were currently planning a lavish backyard party to celebrate the final locking mechanism of their theft. Every answer I found had pulled open another door, and every door revealed a darker, more calculated layer of intent. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed I was merely a wife. They forgot what I do for a living. I am an auditor. I dismantle fraudulent structures, and I was going to raze this entire fake family to the ground. The digital forensics contractor had given me the architecture of the lie. The attorney in Portland gave me the coordinates of the truth. Finding the falsified hospital logs was a matter of tracing the network access. Finding a missing human being required a different kind of excavation. People leave paper trails, but stolen children are deliberately erased from the grid. I instructed my attorney to ignore standard birth registries and look for anomalies in the state family court dockets for King and Pierce counties during the specific 7-day window following my emergency surgery. We were looking for a sealed, expedited private adoption. It took the attorney exactly 4 days to bypass the red tape and locate the sealed file. The documents were forwarded to my encrypted server on a Tuesday night. I opened the PDF file and stared at the scanned pages of a finalized adoption decree. It was handled by a boutique, high-end private placement agency in Seattle that had quietly dissolved its corporate charter 3 years ago. The paperwork detailed the transfer of a female infant, surrendered legally and unconditionally within 48 hours of birth. I scrolled to the consent forms. There was a signature on the line designated for the biological mother. It was a chaotic, looping scrawl that vaguely resembled my name. Beside it was a photocopy of a state driver license. It was a very good forgery, but the plastic lamination glare in the photocopy covered the height and eye color fields. The notary stamp belonged to a woman who had previously served on a hospital charity board chaired by my mother-in-law, Elaine. They had not just walked out the back door with my child. They had manufactured a perfectly legal, airtight paper trail to permanently sever my biological rights before I had even woken up from the anesthesia. My immediate instinct, the primal, biological urge of a mother, was to prepare for a horror story. When children are moved through black market or gray market adoptions, they often end up in broken systems, leveraged for money, or worse. I braced myself to find a victim. I prepared to deploy every financial and legal weapon at my disposal to extract her from a nightmare. I ran a comprehensive background check on the adoptive parents listed in the decree, Leah and Ben Bennett. I pulled their public tax records, property deeds, and employment histories. I cross-referenced their digital footprints. I did not find a nightmare. I found a quiet, unremarkable, and incredibly stable reality. Leah Bennett is a 4th-grade mathematics teacher at a public elementary school. Ben Bennett teaches high school history. Their combined annual gross income is roughly $140,000. They do not have offshore accounts. They do not have family trust funds. They own a modest, 3-bedroom craftsman house in Tacoma, Washington, exactly 32 miles south of my sprawling, cold mansion in Kirkland. They hold a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. They drive a 7-year-old station wagon. They pay their property taxes on time. They were not co-conspirators. They were the perfect marks. A respectable middle-class couple desperate for a child, selected precisely because they were entirely disconnected from my husband's wealthy, corporate social sphere. They had been handed a baby and a fabricated story about a young mother who could not cope. They had no idea their daughter was the casualty of a hostile corporate takeover. They named her Wren Bennett. She was 7 years old. I could not simply knock on their front door. I needed visual confirmation. I needed to see her. I spent 3 hours navigating the public social media pages of the Tacoma School District, scanning through digital newsletters, parent-teacher association bulletins, and community event galleries. At 1:15 in the morning, I found her. It was a high-resolution photograph embedded in a local district newsletter from last spring. The headline read, "Regional Primary School Science and Engineering Fair." There were 4 children in the photograph, standing behind folding tables in a gymnasium. My eyes locked onto the girl second from the left. She was wearing a faded blue cotton shirt and denim overalls. Her dark hair was pulled back into a slightly messy ponytail, held by a plain yellow elastic band. She was standing behind a complex, multi-tiered structure built entirely out of balsa wood, rubber bands, and small metal gears. I stopped breathing. The silence in my office was absolute. I zoomed in on the photograph, magnifying the pixels until her face filled my entire monitor. I did not cry. My chest seized with a pressure so immense it felt like my ribs were fracturing, but my eyes remained completely dry. The pain did not come from a melodramatic wave of sorrow. The pain came from the brutal, undeniable precision of the data in front of me. She had my eyes, the exact same shade of dark, slate gray. She had the exact structural slope of my cheekbones. But it was not just the static biology that stopped my heart. It was the kinetic data. In the photograph, she was not looking at the camera. She was looking down at a complicated joint on her balsa wood structure. Her head was tilted exactly 15 degrees to the left. Her brow was slightly furrowed, and the corner of her lower lip was pulled inward, trapped beneath her front teeth. It was the exact face I make when I am analyzing a corrupted spreadsheet. It was the face of a girl who looks at the world and tries to understand the mechanics of how it operates. According to the brief caption beneath the photo, Wren Bennett's project on kinetic energy transfer had won first place in her age division. Her teachers described her as highly intelligent, remarkably calm under pressure, and unusually observant. She was me. She was a miniature, perfect echo of my own mind. Growing up 32 miles away in a house I had never seen, eating dinner with two people I had never met, I sat back in my leather chair. I looked at the photograph of my daughter for a very long time. That single digital image fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of my operation. Before finding the photo, my objective had been a simple, brutal reclamation. I was going to march into a courtroom, detonate a legal bomb, burn my husband to ashes, and take my stolen property back. But looking at Wren, holding a plastic trophy with a look of quiet, focused pride, I realized a terrifying truth. She was not a stolen car. She was not a hijacked corporate asset. She was a living, breathing human being who had her own rhythm, her own history, and her own sense of safety. Leah and Ben Bennett were her parents in every way that mattered to a 7-year-old child. If I detonated a bomb to destroy Owen, the blast wave would completely obliterate Wren's reality. It would tear her away from the only mother and father she had ever known. It would turn her childhood into a traumatic, highly publicized circus. I refused to be like Owen. I refused to treat a child as a piece of leverage in a war. I closed the browser window. I locked my encrypted server. My choice was made. I would absolutely ruin the man I married. I would strip him of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. I would make sure his mother faced federal prison time. I would dismantle every single pillar of the life they had built on my stolen blood. But I would do it invisibly. I would build a firewall around the house in Tacoma. Wren Bennett would never see the flames. She would never hear the explosion. My objective was no longer a loud, chaotic vengeance. It was a precise, microscopic surgery. I was going to cut the cancer out of my life, and I was going to do it without leaving a single scar on my daughter. I wired $25,000 through a blinded corporate philanthropy account to a struggling after-school makerspace in an industrial pocket of Tacoma. The transaction was buried beneath layers of shell companies. The funds were specifically earmarked for advanced robotics kits, miniature drafting tables, and a high-end three-dimensional printer. As the anonymous benefactor's designated compliance officer, I scheduled an in-person audit on a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the community center. I traded my tailored wool coat for a plain waterproof jacket. The building was old. It smelled of sawdust, heated metal, and cheap pine cleaner. The main room was chaotic, filled with the loud, echoing voices of 24 children tearing into cardboard boxes and organizing copper wires. I found her in the far corner. Wren Bennett was sitting at a scratched wooden table, separated slightly from the louder groups. She wore a green sweater with a frayed left cuff. She was not a glowing, angelic figure bathed in cinematic light. She was a serious, deeply focused 7-year-old holding a pair of child-safe craft scissors. She was carefully trying to free a thin red ribbon from a strip of tape, her jaw set in tight determination. I walked over and stood quietly on the opposite side of the table. I did not loom over her. I kept my hands in my pockets. She looked up. Her gray eyes locked onto mine. She did not smile. She was polite, but entirely guarded. I could see the gears turning in her mind, evaluating the stranger in her workspace. She had the distinct, quiet wariness of a child who pays attention to adults, rather than just blindly trusting them. "That is a difficult gauge of wire to strip with that tool," I said, keeping my voice level and conversational. She looked at the wire strippers, then back at me. "The smaller ones are all being used by the robotics team at the center table. If you angle the blade slightly and score the plastic first instead of squeezing all the way through, it will not snap the copper inside," I offered. She tilted her head. It was that exact 15-degree angle. She adjusted her grip, scored the plastic casing, and pulled. The red rubber slid off perfectly, exposing a clean half-inch of shining copper. She set the tool down. Thank you. Are you the lady who bought the new printer for the shop? I work for the company that donated the equipment, I replied. What are you building? She did not launch into an overly eager explanation. She carefully assessed my level of genuine interest. She pointed to a vertical structure made of balsa wood, small plastic gears, and a small direct current motor. It is a vertical axis wind turbine, Wren explained, her voice steady and precise. Most of the kids build the horizontal ones that look like windmills, but those have to point directly into the wind to work. A vertical axis can catch wind from any direction. I am trying to figure out how to maximize the torque so it can power this light bulb. Other adults would have offered hollow praise. They would have called her cute or told her she was very smart. I pulled up a metal folding chair and sat down at eye level with her. The problem with vertical turbines is aerodynamic drag on the returning blades, I said, pointing to the flat wooden panels she had attached to the central shaft. They catch the wind on the way forward, but they fight the wind on the way back. Have you considered curving the panels to deflect the air resistance? Wren stared at me. The polite, guarded shield dropped by a fraction of an inch. A spark of genuine electric curiosity lit up her gray eyes. For the next 45 minutes, we did not discuss family, school, or feelings. We discussed friction coefficients, battery storage capacity, and the structural integrity of glue. I treated her like a colleague. She treated me like a resource. When her mother, Leah Bennett, arrived at 5:15 to pick her up, I quietly stepped back into the shadows of the workshop. I watched Leah wrap a warm scarf around Wren's neck. I watched them walk out to their old station wagon, holding hands. My chest ached with a heavy, hollow pressure, but my mind was completely clear. I drove 32 miles north, back to the polished, sterile wealth of Kirkland. The contrast was a physical shock to my system. I walked into my sprawling living room. The heated concrete floors felt like ice. Theo was sitting on the expensive Italian leather sofa. He had dropped his digital tablet onto the rug. He did not look up when I entered. I am hungry, Theo announced to the empty room. He did not ask for a snack. He stated a condition, fully expecting the environment to instantly resolve it for him. I stood in the doorway and observed him. I did not look at him with hatred. He was not a monster. He was just a boy. But looking at him now, stripped of the biological illusion I had lived under for 7 years, I saw exactly what he was becoming. He was a product of Owen's relentless entitlement. He was a child who had never been told to wait, never been told to figure a problem out on his own, and never been allowed to experience the friction of the real world. He was being meticulously groomed to inherit a kingdom he did not earn. The fruit drawer is at the bottom of the refrigerator, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. You know where the bowls are? Theo finally looked up, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He was entirely unused to being directed to serve himself. He stared at me for a long moment before slowly sliding off the sofa and walking toward the kitchen. Owen came home an hour later. He smelled of expensive cologne and damp wool. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and immediately walked to the granite island in the kitchen, tapping his finger against a thick manila envelope lying near the edge. We are running out of runway on this, Owen said, taking a sip of his drink. He kept his tone light, but the underlying tension was vibrating through his jaw. The lawyers need these trust updates signed and notarized by Friday. It is just administrative housekeeping, but it secures the boy's future. His 8th birthday is approaching quickly. We need the framework locked in. I will review them tonight, I lied flawlessly, pouring myself a glass of water. I have just been tied up with a massive corporate audit at the firm. Owen smiled, a smooth, practiced curve of his lips. I know you are busy, but family legacy comes first. The pressure continued to mount 2 days later when Elaine Mercer arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. She brought an assortment of expensive pastries from a French bakery downtown. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and a string of authentic pearls. She cornered me by the espresso machine while Owen and Theo were outside on the patio. You really must prioritize the paperwork, Natalie, Elaine said, her voice a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. She placed a manicured hand on my forearm. A boy needs to know his place in the world is secure. The lineage must be properly anchored before his 8th year. It is what your grandfather would have wanted. It protects all of us. I looked down at her hand resting on my arm. I thought about the security badge data. I thought about the digital signature she used to erase my daughter from the hospital server. You are absolutely right, Elaine, I said, offering her a cold, perfectly symmetrical smile. Everything is going to be exactly where it belongs. That night, after the house went dark and silent, I sat in my locked home office. I opened my encrypted laptop and began the systematic strangulation of my husband's infrastructure. I did not freeze his accounts entirely. That would trigger an immediate alarm. Instead, I turned the valves with microscopic precision. I logged into our primary wealth management portal. I reduced the daily withdrawal limits on Owen's secondary platinum credit cards from $50,000 to $5,000. I revoked his direct read access permissions to the main corporate escrow accounts I managed for the family office. I accessed the back end of his consulting firm's server using a backdoor route I had installed years ago for security testing. I subtly altered the administrative permissions on his executive assistant's calendar program. Every time she attempted to book a high-level client meeting or authorize a travel expense, the system would require a secondary authentication protocol that routed through a dead email server, causing a 48-hour delay. I was draining his momentum. He would not see a wall. He would simply feel like he was suddenly walking through deep mud. His credit cards would decline on large luxury purchases. His travel arrangements would mysteriously stall. His access to liquid capital would dry up just enough to cause panic, but not enough to prove sabotage. I leaned back in my chair and watched the lines of code finalize on the screen. I was standing perfectly balanced between two entirely different tracks. On one side, 32 miles away, a little girl with my gray eyes was slowly learning to trust the stranger who knew how to build a better turbine. On the other side, the man sleeping down the hall was desperately trying to tie a knot around my throat, using a child he had stolen to steal the rest of my life. Owen wanted everything to be official by the 8th birthday. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I was going to make it all official. I knew exactly where Delaney Price worked. Her boutique public relations firm occupied the top floor of a glass building in the South Lake Union District. I did not call her. I did not send an email requesting a meeting. People who are prepared have time to construct lies. I needed her entirely unprepared. It was a Thursday evening, just past 6 o'clock. The underground parking garage was dimly lit and smelled of damp concrete and expensive car exhaust. I waited in the shadows near a silver luxury sedan registered in her name. When Delaney finally walked out of the elevator, she looked exactly like a woman who believed she was waiting for a crown. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer and carried a designer leather tote. She was 36 years old now, her dark hair cut into a sleek, aggressive bob. She approached her car, pressing the unlock button on her key fob. The headlights flashed. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Hello, Delaney," I said. My voice did not echo. It was flat and heavy. She stopped. Her hand froze halfway to the door handle. She recognized me instantly. I could see the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit her nervous system. Her eyes darted toward the elevator, then back to me. "Natalie," she managed to say, her voice tight but remarkably controlled. "What a surprise. What are you doing down here?" "Unlock the car," I told her. I did not step closer. I maintained a professional, terrifying distance. "We are going to sit inside. You are going to listen to me." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Delaney said, puffing up her chest in a desperate attempt to project authority. "If you do not step aside, I am calling building security." I reached into my tailored coat pocket and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. I tossed it onto the hood of her silver car. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "Inside that envelope is the hospital admission log from 7 years ago," I said, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. It shows your emergency room check-in under an altered insurance alias. It also contains the adoption decree transferring a female infant to a couple in Tacoma, featuring a very crude forgery of my signature. I have already retained a forensic medical attorney. I can either hand these documents to you inside your car, or I can hand them to a federal prosecutor tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The choice is entirely yours. The color completely drained from her face. The aggressive posture collapsed. She looked at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. With a shaking hand, she opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. I walked around the front and got into the passenger side. The leather seats were cold. "I did not want to hurt you," Delaney whispered, staring straight ahead at the concrete wall. The mask was slipping rapidly. "Owen told me you were cold. He told me you did not even want children. He said you only got pregnant because of a family obligation. I do not care what he told you about my personality." I cut her off. I did not raise my voice. I leaned slightly toward her. "I want to know the mechanics of the arrangement." She swallowed hard. Her manicured fingers gripped the steering wheel. She started talking, the words spilling out in a desperate flood of self-justification. She explained that she knew Owen wanted his son to have a better life, a life with access to the Sanders family resources. But she swore, with genuine panic in her eyes, that she believed my daughter was going to be placed with a wealthy, aristocratic family on the East Coast. Owen had promised her the baby girl would be treated like royalty. "He told me the trust required a legitimate heir," Delaney pleaded, turning to look at me. "He said if we waited until Theo turned 8 years old, the voting shares would permanently transfer into a protective holding account managed by Owen. He promised me that the day after the 8th birthday, he would file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. He said he would take his share of the management fees, take Theo, and we would finally be a real family. He told me I just had to wait in the background. That is why I send Theo gifts. That is why I told him everything would be official soon." I looked at her. I did not feel rage toward her. I felt a profound, clinical disgust. She was not a mastermind. She was a spectacularly gullible pawn who had traded her own flesh and blood for a vague promise of future wealth. She actually believed she was the tragic heroine of a romance novel, waiting for her corporate prince. "You really thought he was going to marry you," I said softly. "He is going to marry me," Delaney snapped, a flash of defensive anger returning to her eyes. "He loves me. We have a son together." I opened my briefcase resting on my lap. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of the digital file I had extracted from Owen's encrypted server 3 nights ago. "Owen had his legal team draft this post-nuptial agreement last month," I said, handing the paper across the console. "Read the highlighted section." Delaney took the paper. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. The document outlined a massive restructuring of assets in the event of our divorce. It guaranteed Owen exclusive proxy control over the child's trust, but it explicitly barred any future spouse of Owen from accessing those funds. Furthermore, there was a secondary drafted clause setting up a private, untouchable offshore account for a woman named Delaney Price, offering her a lump sum of $500,000 upon the completion of the trust transfer, contingent on a permanent non-disclosure agreement and a signed waiver of all parental rights to the boy. She was not the future Mrs. Mercer. She was a contractor. She was a loose end he was preparing to pay off and silence forever. He had never intended to let her near the money, and he certainly had no intention of letting her raise the boy. She was merely the biological incubator he used to execute his heist. The paper trembled in her hands. A single tear broke loose and tracked through her expensive makeup. The betrayal fractured her completely. The woman who thought she was a cunning partner suddenly realized she was the victim of the exact same predator. "He promised me," she choked out, her voice breaking. "He swore on our son's life." "Owen only swears on his own bank accounts," I replied coldly. "Now, you are going to give me the leverage you are hiding. Because a woman like you does not wait 7 years in the shadows without an insurance policy." Delaney dropped the paper. She opened her designer tote and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking violently as she bypassed the security screen. She opened a secure, encrypted vault application. "I recorded him," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The night of the surgery, and I kept the emails. All of them." She transferred the files to a secure drop folder I provided. I watched the progress bar on my own phone. Audio files. Screen captures of encrypted messages dating back 8 years, and then a single photograph. It was taken in the dim lighting of a hospital recovery room. It was a close-up of a tiny, newborn wrist. Wrapped around it was a plastic hospital bracelet bearing my name, Natalie Sanders, but the baby wearing it was clearly a boy. Owen had photographed the false evidence before they swapped the bands. It was absolute, undeniable proof of premeditation. These files did not just confirm the infant swap. They outlined the entire chronological timeline of his financial conspiracy. They proved he had spent nearly a decade waiting for the 8th birthday to trigger the trust clause. I verified the transfer was complete. I closed my briefcase. "What happens now?" Delaney asked, her voice small and terrified. "Are you going to the police?" "Do not contact Owen," I instructed her, completely ignoring her question. "Do not warn Elaine. If you send a single text message indicating that we have spoken, I will make sure you face federal kidnapping charges alongside them. If you stay entirely silent, you might survive the fallout. Do you understand?" She nodded frantically, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if she were drowning. I opened the car door and stepped back out into the cold, damp air of the parking garage. I did not slam the door. I closed it quietly. I walked away, the sound of my heels echoing off the concrete pillars. I did not feel a sense of triumphant satisfaction. The air felt heavy. I realized that in this entire sprawling architecture of deceit, there were no innocent adults left, except for Leah and Ben Bennett in Tacoma. My husband was a sociopath. His mother was a corrupt facilitator. Delaney was a mercenary who sold her child, and I was a woman methodically building a guillotine in my own home. The moral ambiguity did not weaken my resolve. It sharpened it. I could not simply blow the whistle and let the authorities sort it out. A blunt explosion would cause collateral damage, and Wren Bennett was not going to be collateral damage. The final strike had to be executed with surgical precision. I had to arrange the board so that when the lights finally came on, everyone was standing exactly where they deserved to be. I did not summon Leah and Ben Bennett to my territory. I rented a neutral, the private conference room in a quiet co-working space in downtown Tacoma, just 4 blocks from the school where Leah taught mathematics. I arranged the meeting through a carefully worded email, stating I had critical, legally sensitive information regarding their daughter's closed adoption, and that I was acting entirely outside of the court system to ensure their family's privacy. They arrived exactly on time. Ben wore a slightly faded corduroy jacket. Leah had the tense, guarded posture of a mother who instinctively senses a threat to her child. They sat across from me at the heavy oak table. I did not offer small talk. I did not offer them coffee. I offered them the truth. Delivered with the precision of a surgeon opening a chest cavity, I placed a single, thick binder on the table between us. "My name is Natalie," I began, keeping my voice low and entirely steady. "I am the woman who funded the new equipment for the makerspace. I am also the biological mother of the girl you call Wren." Leah flinched as if I had struck her across the face. Ben instinctively reached out and gripped his wife's hand. The air in the room instantly turned hostile. "If you are here to extort us, or if you think you can just walk in and take her," Ben said, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and sudden rage, "we will fight you with everything we have. We are her parents. We have the legal decree." "I know you do," I replied smoothly. I pushed the binder across the polished wood. "Open it. Look at the second tab. That is the adoption decree you signed 7 years ago. Now look at the signature line for the biological mother. That is not my handwriting. Look at the attached photocopied identification. The height and eye color are intentionally obscured because they do not match my physical profile." Leah opened the binder. Her eyes darted across the pages. absorbing the forensic metadata, the altered hospital logs, and the emergency room admission record of the other woman. I am not here to take Ren away from you, I said, leaning back in my chair to give them physical space. I am here because my husband, his mother, and the boy's biological mother helped orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud while I was unconscious on an operating table. They stole my daughter and replaced her with his biological son to secure a massive family trust. You were not chosen because you were bad people. You were chosen because you were entirely disconnected from our social circle, making it impossible for me to ever accidentally find you. Leah stared at the documents, her breathing shallow and rapid. The realization was hitting her, a slow, horrifying dawn. The difference between me and my husband is that Owen uses people as blunt instruments. I respect autonomy. I did not demand their immediate surrender. I am not asking you to believe me today, I told them, standing up and buttoning my coat. Take the binder. Hire an independent family law attorney. Have them verify every single document. I have included a retainer fee in the back pocket, so you do not have to drain your savings to protect yourselves. When you realize that I'm telling the truth, and when you realize that I am the only person who can shield Ren from the fallout of the criminal indictments I am about to drop on my husband, you will call me. I walked out of the room, leaving them with the wreckage of their manufactured reality. It took exactly 3 days for the phone to ring. Leah Bennett called me on a secure line on a Saturday morning. Her voice was exhausted, stripped of all the initial defensive anger. They had verified the documents. Their attorney had confirmed the gross irregularities in the sealed adoption file. We will cooperate with whatever legal process you are initiating, Leah said, her words measured and careful. But Ben and I have exactly one condition. Ren is not a piece of evidence. She will not be dragged into a courtroom. She will not be photographed by the press. She will not be made into a public spectacle. Her psychological stability is our absolute priority. If you cannot guarantee that, we will take her and disappear, regardless of the legal consequences. I accept your condition without hesitation. I answered immediately. That is my exact priority as well. Ren will remain entirely insulated. With the Tacoma perimeter secured, I shifted my focus back to the primary target. The Sanders Family Trust was managed by a senior partner at a very old, very conservative Seattle law firm. He had served my grandfather for 2 decades. I arranged a private dinner with him at a quiet, exclusive club overlooking the Puget Sound. Under the guise of routine financial planning, I casually steered the conversation toward the upcoming 8th birthday. The lawyer, assuming I was fully aligned with my husband, confirmed my darkest suspicions. Owen had already submitted the draft paperwork to formally register Theo as the primary beneficiary of the generational voting shares. Owen is quite eager, the senior partner chuckled, slicing into his steak. He requested that the final execution of the documents take place at the Foundation Gala next month. He wants to make it a grand, public passing of the torch right on the boy's birthday. It is highly unorthodox to sign trust transfers at a social event, but he insisted it would project immense family unity to the board of directors. Owen was not just trying to steal the kingdom. He wanted to be crowned in front of an audience. He wanted the absolute validation of the Seattle social elite. I smiled at the lawyer and raised my glass of sparkling water. Owen has always had a flair for the dramatic. We should certainly let him have his moment. The next morning, I instructed my medical privacy attorney in Portland to draft an emergency ex parte injunction. The legal filing was a masterpiece of destructive capability. It outlined the bloodline fraud, the forged birth certificate, and the malicious manipulation of the medical records. If filed, it would instantly freeze all trust assets, suspend Owen's proxy rights, and trigger an automatic federal investigation into the hospital's administrative hierarchy. But I did not authorize the attorney to file it with the court, not yet. Filing the injunction now would result in a quiet, sealed legal battle. Owen would hire expensive defense attorneys. He would spin the narrative, claiming a tragic hospital mix-up. He would use his wealth and his polished reputation to mitigate the damage behind closed doors. I needed the damage to be catastrophic and entirely uncontainable. The final pieces of ammunition arrived during the fourth week of the month. Dr. Miriam Kessler, the covering obstetrician, agreed to a private meeting. Disgusted by the gross violation of medical ethics, she voluntarily handed over a secure digital copy of the original voice memo she had recorded immediately after my surgery. The audio was crystal clear. In the recording, she dictated the exact time of birth, the birth weight, and the biological sex of the infant, a female, simultaneously. My digital forensics contractor delivered the finalized, court-ready report. It definitively proved that the terminal used to overwrite my hospital records was physically located in the private executive office of Elaine Mercer, accessed via her personal biometric login credentials. I now held every single piece of the puzzle. I had the biological mother's confession. I had the altered security logs. I had the surgeon's audio file. I had the drafted post-nuptial agreement proving financial motive. And I had the absolute cooperation of the adoptive parents. I locked the files inside my secure server. I walked through the quiet, expansive rooms of my house in Kirkland. I watched Owen sitting by the fireplace, talking on his phone, projecting the image of a powerful, untouchable patriarch. I watched Elaine drop by to measure the backyard for the massive birthday tent, acting the part of the devoted, aristocratic grandmother. They believed they were architects building a dynasty. They did not realize they were simply actors standing on a stage that I had rigged with explosives. The greatest revenge is never a sudden, screaming outburst in a hallway. A screaming outburst gives your enemy the opportunity to defend themselves. The greatest revenge is absolute silence. It is the meticulous, invisible arrangement of the board. It is forcing every single person to stand on their designated mark, smiling for the cameras, completely unaware of the drop beneath their feet. The gala was exactly 12 days away. I was going to let Owen put on his tuxedo. I was going to let him stand under the chandeliers. I was going to let him reach out and grab the prize he had spent 7 years stealing, and then I was going to turn on the lights. The acoustic signature of a home changes when the foundation begins to rot. The sprawling house in Kirkland used to hum with the low, steady frequency of my husband's manufactured reality. Now, the silence was brittle. Every footstep echoed like a warning. The walls felt like they were slowly closing in. Theo was the first to feel the shift in the atmospheric pressure. Children do not understand the complex mechanics of corporate fraud, but they are apex predators when it comes to sensing vulnerability and tension in adults. He knew something was fundamentally broken. Owen began overcompensating in a way that was suffocating. His sudden influx of cloying affection was entirely out of character. He called Theo his little champion twice a day. He bought him a $300 interactive robotics kit on a random Tuesday, handing it over with a desperate, manic smile. Elaine practically moved into our dining room. She was omnipresent, constantly adjusting Theo's collar, smoothing his hair, and whispering into his ear about how the upcoming gala was going to make him the most important boy in the entire city. They were no longer treating him like a son or a grandson. They were treating him like a prize racehorse right before the final $1 million sprint. I refused to participate in the charade. I did not scream at them. I did not hurl ceramic plates against the marble countertops. I simply stopped being a soft, predictable surface for them to manipulate. I became a brick wall. When Owen handed Theo the expensive robotics kit, I calmly walked over, took the box from the boy's hands, and placed it on the highest shelf in the living room. I instituted a strict, unbreakable set of rules for the house. There would be no unearned privileges. There would be no exorbitant gifts outside of standard holidays. Most importantly, there would be absolutely no signing of any supplementary trust paperwork under the guise of casual family housekeeping. When Elaine tried to tell a nostalgic, highly dramatized story about Theo's birth at the dinner table to manipulate the mood, I looked her directly in the eye and stated that her memory of that night was an absolute fiction. I watched the blood drain from her face. I watched her swallow her own breath. Owen realized he was rapidly losing his grip on my compliance. His next maneuver was classic, textbook psychological manipulation. He tried to pathologize my resistance. He cornered me in the master bathroom late on a Thursday evening. He kept his voice low, coating his words in a thick layer of fake, patronizing concern. He told me I had been acting erratic, cold, and deeply paranoid ever since I ran into Dr. Kessler at the clinic. He suggested that seeing the old surgeon had triggered a delayed, severe onset of postpartum psychosis. He even had the audacity to reach into his tailored suit jacket and hand me a heavy cardstock business card. It belonged to a high-end, discreet psychiatrist he frequently played golf with. He suggested I book a private consultation before my behavior damaged the family permanently. I took the business card from his fingers. I tore it exactly in half, completely down the center, and dropped the pieces into the stainless steel wastebasket. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my sanity. I let the legal system speak for me. 48 hours later, Owen was sitting at his desk at his consulting firm when a process server handed him a formal legal notice. It was a cease and desist letter from my newly retained corporate counsel. It mandated that all communications regarding the Sanders Family Trust, including any beneficiary updates, be routed exclusively through my attorneys. While he was reading that letter in his office, I logged into our primary wealth management portal from my encrypted laptop. I unilaterally froze the joint discretionary account. It was the specific account holding the $95,000 he was actively using to pay the caterers, the florists, and the event coordinators for the massive 8th birthday gala. I cut the financial supply line. He would only discover the freeze when his premium credit card was humiliated and declined by his vendors. The financial block caused an immediate, silent panic within the house. Late that Friday night, Theo woke up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. He stopped at the top of the hardwood stairs. The house was dark, but a sliver of light spilled from the doorway of Owen's ground floor study. Theo heard his father pacing relentlessly across the rug. Owen was speaking frantically on the phone with Elaine. Theo did not understand the legal jargon about proxy rights, estate transfers, or holding accounts. But as he sat in the dark, clutching the wooden banister, he heard the sheer venom in Owen's voice. He heard Owen hiss into the receiver that if the capital was not unlocked and the paperwork was not signed before the gala, the boy was completely useless to their long-term strategy. It was a brutal, world-shattering awakening for a 7-year-old. Theo realized in that dark hallway that he was not the beloved center of the universe. He was a pawn on a chessboard. The people moving him only cared about the gold prize at the end of the board. The next afternoon, I drove 32 miles south to Tacoma. I parked near a quiet municipal park where Wren liked to read on the weekends. She was sitting on a faded green wooden bench, wearing a thick yellow sweater against the autumn chill, reading a heavy book about structural engineering. I walked over and sat down on the opposite end of the bench. We did not speak immediately. We simply watched the wind blow the brown leaves across the grass. Wren carefully closed her book. She did not look at me at first. When she finally turned her head, her slate-gray eyes were piercing. She possessed an emotional intelligence that was terrifying for someone so young. She did not ask about the weather. She bypassed all the polite barriers. "If you are my biological mother," Wren asked, her voice tight and trembling just slightly at the edges, "do you want me to live with you? Or do you just want to win this case against the man who took me?" It was a question that could cut through solid glass. It made my chest ache with a profound, heavy sorrow. I looked directly into her eyes. I did not offer her a sugar-coated fairy tale. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I offered her the absolute, unvarnished truth. "I want the truth," I told her, measuring every single word to ensure she felt the weight of my honesty. "I want to protect you from the people who did this. I want the opportunity to know you, if you ever allow it. But I will not rip you out of the only safe home you have ever known just to soothe my own pain. I will not break your life to fix mine." I watched her shoulders drop. The rigid, defensive tension leaked out of her small frame. A slow, tentative relief washed over her face. She realized I was not treating her like a piece of stolen property to be reclaimed. Victory was no longer about dragging a child back into my empty, echoing house in Kirkland. True victory was ensuring that this brilliant, observant girl knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never be used by an adult ever again. The countdown began at dawn. We were exactly 48 hours away from the boy turning 8 years old, but the execution was scheduled for tonight. Owen had transformed the annual Sanders Family Foundation Gala in downtown Seattle into his own personal coronation. He had spent the last 3 weeks leaking hints to the society press and the corporate board that tonight would feature a major announcement regarding the next generation of the Sanders legacy. He was preparing to publicly lock his biological son into the trust structure in front of 300 witnesses. He believed that if he did it under the bright lights of a grand ballroom, surrounded by cameras and applause, I would be forced to smile and sign the documents just to avoid a humiliating public scandal. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a courier delivered a long, matte black garment box to the house. It was from Elaine. Inside was a bespoke emerald green silk evening gown. Attached to the zipper was a handwritten card on heavy cream cardstock. The note read that the color would bring out my eyes for our family's perfect night. It was a psychological cage woven out of expensive fabric. Elaine was trying to dictate my role. She wanted me to play the part of the compliant, ornamental wife who would sit quietly at the head table and legitimize their theft. I did not throw the dress away. I put it on. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my dressing room, the silk draped perfectly over my shoulders. I clasped a heavy diamond necklace around my throat. I applied a striking deep red lipstick. I had never looked more composed, more polished, or more intensely terrifying. When I walked down the curved staircase at 6 o'clock in the evening, Owen was waiting in the foyer in his tailored black tuxedo. He looked up, and a wave of absolute arrogant relief washed over his face. He saw the dress. He saw the diamonds. He calculated that my vanity and my dedication to the family's public image had overridden my quiet rebellion. He smiled, offering me his arm. He thought he had successfully backed me into a corner. He did not realize that I was wearing the emerald silk not as a uniform of surrender, but as armor for a slaughter. Owen had meticulously curated the guest list for the evening. There were 350 names on the roster: politicians, hedge fund managers, hospital administrators, and local celebrities. But his arrogance had created a fatal vulnerability. He had quietly arranged for Delaney Price to attend under the guise of an independent freelance public relations consultant. He wanted his mistress in the room. He wanted her to witness him securing the fortune that he had promised they would share. Owen had no idea that Delaney had entirely flipped. He did not know that she was currently standing in the hotel lobby, wearing a sophisticated microtransmitter taped flat against her ribs beneath her silk blazer. Every arrogant whisper he offered her, every secret reassurance he muttered in the shadows of the ballroom, was currently being streamed directly to a secure recording server monitored by my legal team. The architecture of my trap was fully deployed. Hidden among the 350 guests were my own people. My lead corporate counsel was currently standing near the champagne tower. Disguised as a +1 to a real estate developer, the senior compliance investigator for the state medical board was mingling near the orchestra pit. A federal financial prosecutor, armed with the evidence of the trust manipulation, was sitting in a black sport utility vehicle parked directly outside the service entrance of the hotel, drinking black coffee and watching the time. They were all in position. They were waiting for me to pull the pin. Miles away. The only innocent person in this entire disaster was completely safe. Leah and Ben Bennett had kept their promise. They did not bring Wren anywhere near Seattle. They had packed their station wagon on Friday afternoon and driven up to a remote, rented cabin near the mountains. There was no cell phone reception. There were no news cameras. Wren was probably sitting by a wood stove right now, sketching diagrams of suspension bridges, completely insulated from the nuclear blast that was about to hit her biological origin story. I had sealed the blast doors to protect her childhood. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. It was 6:15. The black town car was waiting in the circular driveway to take us to the venue. I stood in the cold, cavernous foyer, waiting for Owen to fetch his overcoat from the study. I heard a soft rustling sound from the top of the stairs. Theo walked down the steps. He was dressed in a miniature black suit. For the past 7 years, this boy had walked through this house with the unchecked confidence of a prince. But tonight, that protective layer of manufactured arrogance had completely evaporated. He stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. His hands were gripping the polished wooden banister so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked at me. His dark eyes were wide and filled with a stark, terrifying clarity. He had heard too many hushed phone calls in the middle of the night. He had felt the tectonic plates of the house shifting beneath his feet. He knew he was the center of a war he did not understand. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual demands. It was just a small, fragile vibration in the quiet room. "Is someone going to leave me tonight?" It was the first time I saw the terrified child beneath the grooming. Owen and Elaine had built him to be a weapon, but he was just a 7-year-old boy who realized he was standing on thin ice. A lesser woman would have lied. A softer mother would have rushed forward, wrapped him in a hug, and whispered that everything was going to be perfectly fine. But I do not deal in fabricated comfort. I do not feed people illusions, especially not when the illusion is about to be shattered in front of 300 people. I walked over to the staircase. I did not reach out to hold him. I stood exactly at his eye level. "A lot of lies are going to die tonight," I told him, keeping my voice brutally honest but completely steady. "The way things are right now is going to end. People you trust are going to be held responsible for things they have done. It is going to be loud, and it is going to be frightening." Theo's lower lip trembled. A single tear pooled in the corner of his eye. "But listen to me," I continued, my tone dropping an octave, turning into an unbreakable vow. "I am not going to let you disappear. You are not going to vanish. Do you understand me?" He stared at me. He absorbed the absolute certainty in my voice. He did not get a fairy tale ending, but he got the one thing no one else in this house had ever given him: the exact truth. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. He swallowed hard and wiped his eye with the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket. That single thread of truth became his anchor. It was the only thing that would keep him from entirely disintegrating when the hurricane made landfall. Owen walked back into the foyer, sliding his arms into a cashmere overcoat. He checked his heavy silver watch. "Are we ready?" Owen asked, flashing a brilliant, empty smile. "The press is waiting. It is going to be a historic evening." I turned away from Theo. I looked at the man who had stolen my daughter and tried to steal my family's legacy. My pulse was a slow, rhythmic drum against my ribs. "Yes," I said smoothly, walking toward the heavy oak door. "Let us go show everyone exactly what kind of family we are." The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in downtown Seattle was an architectural masterpiece of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. It smelled of expensive champagne, roasted duck, and the distinct, polished scent of generational wealth. 300 of the most influential people in the Pacific Northwest were seated at round tables draped in heavy white linen. They were politicians, hospital board members, and corporate titans, all gathered to witness the strength of the Sanders legacy. Owen stood at the podium on the elevated stage. He looked magnificent. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hair expertly styled, exuding the calm, magnetic charm that had successfully masked his sociopathy for nearly a decade. The massive digital projector screen behind him displayed the intricate, sprawling branches of the family holding company. "Legacy is not merely about wealth," Owen said into the microphone, his voice resonating through the state-of-the-art sound system. He smiled warmly at the audience. "Legacy is about the future. It is about anchoring our family's values into the next generation. Tonight, as my son approaches his 8th birthday, we are taking the final, formal step to integrate him into the foundation of the Sanders Family Trust." He gestured toward the front table. Theo, looking incredibly small in his black suit, walked up the brief flight of carpeted stairs and stood beside the man he believed was his father. Owen placed a heavy manicured hand on the boy's shoulder. An assistant brought a leather-bound folio and a gold fountain pen to the podium. The room erupted into polite, rhythmic applause. They were waiting for me to walk up the stairs, stand beside my husband, and sign my absolute surrender. I stood up from my chair at the center table. The emerald green silk of my dress caught the light of the chandeliers. I did not walk toward the stairs. I stood perfectly still, looking up at the stage. "Before we execute the final signatures," I said, I did not yell. I projected my voice from my diaphragm, a technique I learned for commanding hostile boardrooms. The acoustic design of the room carried my words perfectly. "There is a required addendum to the family record that must be presented." Owen's smile flickered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, assuming I was making a sentimental, unplanned speech. "Of course, Natalie. The floor is yours." I raised my right hand slightly, giving the prearranged visual signal to the audiovisual technician stationed in the back booth. I had paid him $10,000 in untraceable cash to lock out the primary system controls. The screen behind Owen went completely black. A second later, a high-resolution PDF document snapped onto the display. It was the 20-week fetal anatomy scan. The medical phrasing was blown up to massive proportions. Fetal sex. Female fetus. A confused murmur rippled through the front row of tables. Owen turned around to look at the screen. His jaw tightened. "It seems we are experiencing a minor technical glitch with the presentation." Owen laughed, a hollow, scraping sound. "If the technicians could please clear the screen." The screen did not clear. It changed. The next slide was the forensic digital audit log from the hospital server. It highlighted the manual overwrite of the infant's gender, time-stamped 3 days after the emergency surgery. Beside the timestamp was the administrative user identification code. The text clearly identified Elaine Mercer as the authorizing party. The polite murmurs vanished. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, dense, and suffocating. Elaine, sitting 3 chairs away from my empty seat, dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent crash that echoed like a gunshot. Before anyone could speak, the audiovisual system broadcast an audio file over the main speakers. It was the voice of Dr. Miriam Kessler, recorded 7 years ago in a surgical recovery room. The clinical, detached voice filled the massive space. "Emergency cesarean section complete. Patient stabilized. Infant extracted. Vital signs normal. Live birth. Female." "Cut the audio," Owen shouted, his composure entirely disintegrating. He abandoned the podium and stepped toward the edge of the stage, his face flushed with sudden panic. "This is a malicious cyber attack on our foundation. Someone cut the feed immediately." "It is not a cyber attack, Owen," a woman's voice rang out from the back of the room. The crowd parted as Delaney Price walked down the center aisle. She wore a severe gray suit. She did not look like a woman waiting for a wedding ring. She looked like a woman who had just realized she was standing in front of a firing squad and decided to take the commander down with her. Delaney walked until she was standing directly in front of the stage. She held up her phone. "He promised me the baby would go to an aristocratic family," she said, her voice shaking but amplified by the sheer silence of the room. "He promised me that when Theo turned 8, the trust would be secured, he would file for a divorce, and he would finally marry me. He lied to all of us." The senior partner of the legal firm managing the Sanders Family Trust stood up from his table. He buttoned his suit jacket, his face a mask of profound legal horror. "Mr. Mercer," the attorney said, his tone icy, "if these allegations of bloodline manipulation and forged medical records possess even a fraction of validity, every document on that podium constitutes federal beneficiary fraud. The trust is immediately frozen." Owen looked out at the 300 guests. He looked at the politicians, the executives, and the social elite he had spent years courting. They were not looking back at him with sympathy. They were looking at him with the cold, absolute disgust reserved for a leper. They were already stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from his radioactive collapse. "Where is the girl?" someone whispered loudly from the second row. "Did you bring the real daughter?" I turned to face the crowd. My posture was perfectly straight. "My daughter is exactly where she belongs tonight," I stated clearly. "She is in a safe, quiet place, entirely shielded from this room. She is a 7-year-old child, not a piece of physical evidence to be paraded for your entertainment. I refuse to let any child pay the price for the grotesque ambition of the adults in this family." I looked up at the stage. Theo was standing frozen next to the podium, his small chest heaving with silent, terrified breaths. I walked up the carpeted stairs. I ignored Owen completely. I knelt down in front of Theo, blocking his view of the chaotic, whispering crowd. I took his trembling hands in mine. I looked into his eyes and gave him a single, reassuring nod. I kept my promise. I did not let him disappear. From the side entrance of the ballroom, 3 individuals in dark suits walked deliberately toward the stage. They were the state medical board investigator and 2 federal financial prosecutors. They did not carry handcuffs. They did not tackle Owen to the ground. That kind of melodrama was beneath the occasion. The lead prosecutor simply walked up to Owen and Elaine. He spoke in a low, authoritative voice, requesting that they step into the private holding room down the hall to discuss an immediate criminal indictment regarding wire fraud, identity theft, and medical conspiracy. Owen looked at his mother. Elaine was hyperventilating, her aristocratic facade entirely shattered. They walked off the stage and down the aisle. Nobody spoke to them. Nobody offered to call them a defense attorney. The elite society of Seattle watched them walk toward their absolute ruin in total, unforgiving silence. The social execution was flawless. The aftermath of that night unfolded with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate liquidation. The trust was locked behind an impenetrable wall of federal injunctions. Owen was stripped of his consulting firm, his reputation, and his freedom. Remanded to a federal detention facility while awaiting trial for a massive list of felony charges. Elaine lost her medical administrative license in disgrace and faced her own set of conspiracy indictments. Delaney Price entered a plea agreement, turning over every encrypted email and recorded conversation in exchange for immunity, securing her status as the state's primary witness. Through the chaos, Leah and Ben Bennett retained full, uninterrupted temporary custody of Wren. We initiated a quiet, highly mediated legal process to establish my permanent guardianship rights. I did not rush the courts. I let the Bennetts guide the transition, ensuring Wren felt safe at every single milestone. As for Theo, I did not throw him out of the mansion. I did not abandon him to the foster care system or hand him back to Delaney, who had voluntarily surrendered her rights anyway. I kept him, but the environment changed entirely. We moved out of the cold, sprawling house in Kirkland and bought a smaller, warmer home near the water. There were no more unearned privileges. There were no more empty promises about ruling the world. I enrolled him in intensive behavioral therapy. I gave him rules, structure, and for the first time in his life, an honest foundation. He was no longer a pawn on a chessboard. He was just a boy learning how to be a person. The noise of my life finally settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. A few weeks later, on a brisk Saturday morning, I drove my car down a quiet residential street in Tacoma. I pulled into the driveway of the Bennett family home. The garage door was open. I walked up the concrete driveway. Wren was standing over the open hood of the old station wagon. She was wearing a pair of faded denim overalls, heavily stained with engine grease. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was holding a heavy socket wrench, staring intently at the engine block. She heard my footsteps and looked up. Her slate-gray eyes met mine. She did not run to me. She did not call me mother. We were building something entirely new, from the ground up, and building things properly takes time. Wren wiped a streak of dark oil from her forehead using the back of her wrist. She looked at the heavy metal wrench in her hand, then looked back at me. "Do you know how to change a spark plug?" she asked, her voice entirely serious. I stood at the edge of the garage. I unbuttoned my tailored coat and carefully folded it over a nearby wooden chair. I rolled up the sleeves of my white cotton shirt. "No," I answered, walking toward the front bumper of the car. But I learned fast. Wren gave a small, barely perceptible nod. She took a step backward, sliding slightly to the left, leaving exactly enough space for me to stand beside her under the hood. There were no grand titles. There were no tears. There was simply the quiet, profound mechanical truth of two people finally standing exactly where they were always meant to be. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Where are you tuning in from today? Please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so more people can hear this story.